Hey Chaver, what's cracking? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we have the pleasure of learning Daf 10 of Masechta Ayruvin together. Friends, grab your thinking caps from yesterday, put them on your heads, take a second to organize your thoughts, then we'll get started. Let's do an overview. So the Daf begins beginning on our discussion about Nira mi bachutz v'shava mi b'fnim nidon kilechi or not. That when you have a lechi that you can recognize from the outside but not from inside the mavui, can you treat that as a lechi or not? We're going to do a very complex analysis, very multifaceted, many pieces moving that we got to hold in our little brains. I'm going to do an analysis of this sugya. And then we talk about a mavui that is 20 amos wide. I'm sure many people have been waiting for this sugya for the last 10 daf. Well, we'll get to it today. And then at the end we talk about toilets, about the connection between toilet seats and and Ayruvin and mavuis. So that's going to be Did you ever think about that? Well, you'll have plenty of time to think about it today. Chaver, let's go weiter. So, where should we start? Where do you guys want to start? How about this? Let's just start with an introduction. So, yesterday we had the statement of, Rav Huna, we had Amar Rabba bar Rav Huna, Nir mi b'chutz v'shav mi b'fnim nidam mishum lechi. Right, so we had machlokas basically, between Rabbi Yechanan and Rabbi Chia, about this concept of nidon mi b'chutz v'shav mi b'fnim. What if you have a mavui? What if you have a lechi that from the outside you could tell that it's there, but from the inside you cannot, right? So let's say you're in the mavui, and when you're walking in the mavui, you can't tell that there's a lechi at the end of it, either because it's completely flush with the wall and continues outside into Rishus Rabbim, or maybe because it's at a right angle, right? Meaning you'd have to, let's say, leave the mavui and make a right in order to see that it's there. Can that be treated like a lechi or not? I mean, the fact of the matter is that there's a lechi there, but when you're in the mavui, you can't actually see it. So, Rabbi Yochanan says it's not a good lechi. Rabbi Chia says that it is a good lechi, okay? Rav Huna said also that it would be considered a good lechi, to which we then asked a kasha from our favorite Mishnah of the past few days, which is, or our least favorite, depending on your relationship with it. Mine is somewhat complicated. Akopanim. So we have this larger hatzer, and you have a smaller hatzer that opens up into the larger hatzer. Okay? So now, from the perspective of the smaller hatzer, that wall, that breached wall where it opens up into the larger hatzer is completely gone. There's no wall whatsoever. It's completely open to the larger hatzer. Now, from the perspective of the larger hatzer, however, you can tell that on either side of that opening from where the small hatzer opens up into the larger hatzer, there are actually little bits of wall. And those little bits of wall, we'll talk about that in a second, but those little bits of wall make the opening from the hatzer from the smaller hatzer into the larger hatzer, basically make that just a regular Pesach. So from the perspective of the larger hatzer, there's Pashit Pesach over there, and therefore you're allowed to carry in the larger hatzer as long as the houses are made a Ayruvin chatzeris. However, from the perspective of the smaller hatzer, you don't know that there's a little bit of wall on either side of the opening into the larger hatzer. Therefore, it becomes a question of how do we treat nir mi bachutz v'shav mi b'fnim? How do we treat the fact that you have these bits of wall that from the outside perspective, from the perspective of the larger hatzer, you could tell that those walls are there, and that really this opening from the smaller hatzer is really just a Pesach and a larger construct. However, from the perspective of the hatzer, you don't know that it's there, and it's just a pirza. So if we say that nir mi bachutz v'shav mi b'fnim would not count as a lechi, right? Eino nidon kelechi. Well, then that explains why the Mishnah says that you're not allowed to carry in the smaller hatzer, because there's no lechi over there, and it's just a smaller hatzer, Rishus HaYachid, that is completely opened up as a complete pirza into this larger hatzer, and therefore you would not be allowed to carry in the smaller hatzer because it opens up into a larger hatzer. However, if you want to argue like Reb Chia argues, and like Rabbi Bar Rav Huna is arguing, that near Reb Chutz v'shavim b'fnim nidon kilechi, well, if that's the case, then how come the Mishnah says that you're not allowed to carry in the smaller chatzer? After all, we know from our perspective on the outside, from our perspective in the larger chatzer, we know that really this smaller chatzer, the entrance, has 2 lechis on the outside. So therefore, that should be enough to allow you to carry in the smaller chotzer. So that is our question on Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Bar Rav Huna, right? That if they are correct, that nir mi b'chutz v'shavim mi b'fnim nidon kilechi, well then as far as we're concerned, the smaller chotzer has a lechi, and if that's the case, then why does the Mishnah say that you're not allowed to carry in there? So great. So let us continue with what we said yesterday. So the Gemara gave, was really trying very hard to explain this Mishnah according to Rabbi Chia and according to Rabbi Bar Rav Huna, who say that nidon nir mi b'chutz v'shavim mi b'fnim is nidon kilechi. So, and first we employed the opinion of Reb Zera, which is that, well, actually these walls from the smaller chotzer are actually extending into the larger chotzer. So they're not actually flush against the lechi. And because they're not flush against the lechi, so therefore, where these walls are extending into the larger chotzer, and where they end, well, there actually is no lechi over there. And therefore, it's not actually a case where there's a lechi on the outside, because here where the walls end, there is no lechi. But then the Gemara asks, but what about lavud? Because after all, we have this brisa that was quoted by Rav Ada bar Avimi, which is going to play a very crucial role in the next, few minutes, or might be slightly more than that, sorry, which is that the width of this larger chutzner is 11 amos, and the width of the smaller chutzner is 10 amos, which means that there's a total of 1 amma difference in width. Now, if you spread that out equally, on either side, meaning if you say that the larger chutzner and the smaller chutzner are centered, right, along a center axis, well, then you have 3 tfachim on either side, right, 3 tfachim of wall on either side of where the small chutzner opens up into the larger chutzner. Now, if that's the case, well then, if we're saying, like Reb Zera, that this wall extends into the larger chutzner, well then those walls are within 3 tfachim of the, because the walls also have a thickness, so they're within 3 tfachim of the side walls of the larger chutzner. Now, if you're going to say lavud, then that means that there's no space between them, which then, effectively means that there is a lechi on either side of these walls that extend into the larger chutzner. So, again, then why are you not allowed to carry in the smaller chutzner? So then we had Ravina, who said, well, actually they weren't centered, the larger chutzner and the smaller chutzner are not centered on a middle axis. Rather, it's the smaller chutzner is kind of off to the side a little bit, and therefore there's actually only 2 tfachim between one wall, one of the walls of the smaller chutzner and the wall of the wider chutzner, and the other side has 4 tfachim between the wall of the smaller chutzner and the wall of the larger chutzner, and because of that, there's only a lechi on one side, meaning because we're going to say lavud on the side that has the 2 tfachim, we'll say lavud, and there's a lechi, but on the other side there's 4 tfachim between the extended wall of the smaller chutzner and the wall of the wider chutzner, and 4 tfachim you can't say lavud, so you only have a lechi on one side. That is where we ended off yesterday, and that was going to be part of the explanation of why you are not allowed to carry in that smaller chutzner, because even though we do say nir mi b'chutz v'shavim mi b'fnim nidon kilechi, but here there's only a lechi on one side, not on the other. Now, this gets us to a machlokas between Rabbi Yossi, well, 2 machlokas. A machlokas between Rebbe and the Chachamim, and also a machlokas between Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim. So let's start with Rebbe and the Chachamim. So there is a machlokas between Rebbe and the Chachamim about what do you do when you have a Rishus HaYachid that has a wall that's completely breached into Rishus HaRabim. Okay? So you're not allowed to carry in that Rishus HaYachid. However, what you can do is you can do this machlokas, do this thing that is a machlokas between Rebbe and Chacham. Namely, according to the Chacham, all you have to do is you have to put one lechi there by this breached opening, and then you can carry in the Rishus HaYachid. Okay? According to Rebbe, you have to put up 2 lechis, or in the case of Rishus HaYachid, it's called a pas, right? In the case of a mavui, it's called a lechi. In the case of Rishus HaYachid, it's called a pas. So, according to Rebbe, you have to put up 2 of these pasin in order to be able to carry in this Rishus HaYachid. Now, there's another machlokas, which is machlokas between Rabbi Yossi and the Chacham about how wide does a lechi have to be, or in this case, a pas. So, according to Rabbi Yossi, it has to be 3 tfachim wide. According to the Chacham, it could be any amount. It really doesn't matter. Sweet. Friends, now that we have all that information in our little brains, let us take a second to take a deep breath and say, I can do this, and then follow me. Okay. So, bottom line of Tes Amud Beis, V'lema lavud meruach achas v'tishtri. So, the Gemara asks, again, so we're trying to understand, according to Rabbi Chia, and according to Rabbi Chia, and according to Rabbi Bar Rav Huna, who say that nirmi v'chutz v'shavim b'fnim is nidon kelechi. Well, if that's the case, we're trying to figure out how come then you're not allowed to carry in this smaller hatzer. Okay? So, we gave this very convoluted answer, because after all, we can't ignore the brisa that Rav Ada Bar Avimi mentions, which is that the larger hatzer has a width of 11 amos, the thinner hatzer has a width of 10 amos, which means that there's only a total difference of 1 amma width. And so the question was, if we assume that nir mi b'chutz v'shavim mi b'fnim is a good lechi, well then, if these chatzers were centered, well then on either side of the opening from the smaller chatzer to the larger chatzer, you basically have 3 tfachim of wall on either side, in which case you certainly have a good lechi, that if we say near mi b'chutz v'shav mi b'fnim is nidon kelechi, well then you should be able to carry in the smaller chatzer. So to which we said Reb Zera and Ravina's opinion, Reb Zera being that the walls extend into the larger chatzer, from the smaller chatzer, and also Ravina, which said that they're not exactly lined on the middle axis, rather it's off to the side a little bit, and therefore on one side it's within 2 tfachim of the outer wall of the larger chatzer, so you would have a lechi there because you would say lavud, but on the other side you would have 4 tfachim between the extended wall of the smaller chatzer and the outer wall of the larger chatzer, and you can't say lavud, so all you have is a lechi on one side of the breach from their smaller chatzer into the larger chatzer, and we wanted to argue that that's why you wouldn't be allowed to carry in the smaller chatzer because of this, because there's only one lechi, right? It's basically a rishus ha-yachid that opens up into another rishus, right? Not a rishus ha-rab, it's another rishus ha-yachid, but it's a rishus ha-yachid that opens up into another rishus, and therefore, you would not be allowed to carry in that smaller chatzer. Now, the Gemara asks, but v'lema lavud meruach achas v'tishtri, but still, what's wrong with having only one lechi? Right? I mean, he says lavud meruach achas, meaning that one side where the wall would be 2 tfachim away, the extended wall of the smaller chatzer is 2 tfachim away from the outer wall of the larger chatzer. So then we should say lavud, and therefore those are connected, which means that that's a good lechi, right? Which means while on the other side it's 4 tfachim away, so you can't say that. But on this side, on one side you can, so there should be a lechi mitzad echad. And like the Chacham, who say that all you need is one lechi, you should be allowed to carry in the smaller chatzer. Okay, so now we finally get to our today's daf. Yud Amar Aleph. Rebbe Amar Ba'inat Shnei Pasin. So we say, yeah, but that wouldn't work because this Mishnah about the larger chutzner and the smaller chutzner is actually taught by Rebbe. And Rebbe says that you need shnei pasim. You actually need 2 lechis in order to carry, if you have a Rishus HaYachid that is open into Rishus HaRabim, or in our case, another Rishus HaYachid. In order to carry in that Rishus HaYachid, you would need 2 lechis. And here you only have 1 lechi. The Tanya, as we learned in a Brisa, Chatzer niteres b'pas echad, that a Chatzer, like Kilo Rishus HaYachid that is open into Rishus HaRabim, how can you be allowed to carry in the Rishus HaYachid? Rabbi Omer b'shnei pasin, I skipped something. Chatzer niteres b'pas echad, Rabbi Omer b'shnei pasin. So if you have this Rishus HaYachid that opens up into Rishus HaRabim, so the Tanna Kama says that all you need is one pas, which is the equivalent of a lechi, and Rebbe says that you need two of them. And because this mission of the two chatzers is Rebbe, that is why having only one of these lechis would not be enough, and that's why you cannot carry in the chatzer. Even if you say that nir b'chutz v'shavim b'fnim is nidon kilechi. The Gemara is going to ask a very complex question in order to make the argument that it is much more effective to say that nir b'chutz v'shavim b'fnim eino nidon kilechi, that you cannot treat it as a good lechi. Here we go. Hi, Mai. What do? I amart b'shlama nira mibachutz v'shave mibifnim eino nidon. That if we say that nira mibachutz v'shave mibifnim is not eino nidon mishum lechi, is not treated as a lechi, well then everything is actually very neat and organized. We have the larger chatzer, we have the smaller chatzer. The larger chatzer is 11 amos wide. The smaller chatzer is 10 amos wide, which means that, if we want to just be very neat about it, forget about all those hacks from Reb Zera and Ravina in order to answer for nir mibachutz v'shavim mibifnim nidon mishum lechi. Forget about that. If we say eino nidon mishum lechi, everything is very nice and neat. Okay? So, v'Rebbe Savala Reb Yossi, v'Reb Zera v'Ravina lesa, mishum achi ketana be'eser, u'glol ba'achas esrei, mishum d'Rebbe Savala Reb Yossi. What does that mean? So, if you say that nira mibachutz v'shavim mibifnim eino nidon kilechi, well then everything is very, very neat. How come everything is very, very neat? Because you have the larger chatzer. You have a smaller chatzer that is opening up into a larger chatzer. We have a brisa, which we have to take into account, which is that the larger chatzer is 11 amos wide, and the smaller chatzer is 10 amos wide. Now, if you just lay things out as neatly as possible, well, then you would have them lined up on a center axis, on a middle axis, and you would divide up the extra space from the larger chatzer equally, and therefore you would have 3 tfachim of wall on one side of where the smaller chatzer opens up into the larger chatzer. You have 3 tfachim of wall on the other side. Forget about Reb Zera. Forget about Ravina. Don't worry about the walls of the smaller chatzer extending into the larger chatzer. Don't worry about the smaller chatzer being off to the side a little bit and 2 amos distribution and 2 tfachim and 4 tfachim distribution. Forget about all of that. It's just nice and neat. You got the larger chatzer 11 amos wide. The smaller chatzer, 10 amos wide. You have 3 tfachim of wall on either side of the opening from the small chatzer into the larger chatzer. And the Mishnah reads beautifully, right? It's like Rebbe, who requires that you need 2, pasin in order to be able to carry in a Rishus HaYachid that opens up, let's say into Rishus HaRabim, or in this case into another Rishus HaYachid. And it's also like Rabbi Yossi, who says that each one of these pasin, or each one of these lechis that are basically the same thing, need 3 tfachim of width, or need to be 3 tfachim. So, therefore, it works out perfectly. From the perspective of the chatzer, so it's a Rishus HaYachid that opens up into, right, the larger chatzer is a Rishus HaYachid that opens up into another Rishus HaYachid, okay? Now, what can you do? You're not allowed to carry. Well, actually, it'll be fine. You can carry, because where the larger chatzer opens up into the smaller chatzer, you have these 2 lechis on either side of the opening. And it's like Rebbe, who says that that's exactly what you need in this case. You need 2 of these lechis. And each lechi is 3 tfachim, right? Because the extra amma from the larger chatzer is divided in half. 1 amma being 6 tfachim. You divide that in half. You have 3 tfachim on either side of the opening to the smaller chatzer. So it is perfect. You don't need Reb Zera. You don't need Ravina. In the larger chatzer, you can carry because you have these 2 lechis that are each 3 tfachim wide, like Rebbe, who says that you need 2 lechis, and like Rabbi Yossi, who says that that the lechi should be 3 tfachim wide. Beautiful. And now, from the perspective of the smaller chatzer, you cannot carry, because since we say nir mibachutz v'shavim mibifnim eino nidum mishum lechi. So while these lechis are good for the outer chatzer where you could see them, but for the, for the bigger chatzer, but for the smaller chatzer, you can't see them. You don't know that they exist. So as far as we're concerned, eino nidon mishum lechi. You can't treat them as a lechi. Therefore, you cannot carry in the smaller chatzer. Everything, works out. It's complicated, but, as long as you put everything in place, it works out very neatly. Okay? And, but if you say that when you could see the lechi from the outside but not from the inside, it is nidon mishum lechi, it's still a good lechi, well then this is where things get utterly messy, extremely, extremely messy. Because udrab zera, udravina isa, now you have to apply the rules of Rab Zera and Ravina. You have to say that the walls from the smaller chatzer extend into the larger chatzer so that there's no lechi immediately at the end of the walls. And then we also say, like Ravina, that they're not aligned on their middle axis, and therefore one side is within 2 tefachim away from the outer wall. So you say lavud, so there's a lechi on one side, but the other side is 4 tefachim away from the wall, so you can no longer say lavud, so you only have a lechi on one side. And because we all like Rebbe, that one-sided lechi is not enough. But also you have to say that Rebbe doesn't hold like Rabbi Yossi, because if Rebbe holds like Rabbi Yossi that the lechi needs to be 3 tefachim, well then you wouldn't even be allowed to carry in the outer chatzer, because the outer, because we still are assuming that this Mishnah is like Rebbe, which means that you need 2 lechis. Now, if Rebbe holds like Rabbi Yossi that each lechi needs to be 3 tefachim, well, we're saying that one side is 2 tefachim, the other side is 4 tefachim, so on one side there's a lechi, but on the other side you don't have a lechi. So now, in order to make this make sense, if you say, Nir mi b'chutz v'shavim mi b'pnim, nidon mishum lechi, well then you have to say that Rebbe doesn't hold like Rabbi Yossi in terms of the width of the lechi, okay? Rebbe lo savar like Rabbi Yossi. Now, gdola b'achas esrei lamali. But then we hit another snag, which is, how do we understand the brisa that Rav Ada bar Avimi is quoting, where it says that the outer, that the bigger chutzner is 11 amos wide, the smaller chutzner is 10 amos wide? Like, this just adds to the mess. Because why? Like, why would the brisa point that out? Why would the brisa say that we're talking about a chutzner that is 11 amos wide, and a bigger chutzner that's 11 amos wide, and a smaller chutzner that's 10 amos wide? If the point of the brisa is to explain to us why you're allowed to carry in the larger chutzner, because it has these 2 lechis, right? Because we're saying that Rebbe requires 2 lechis, and Rebbe does not hold like Rabbi Yossi, and therefore these lechis can be any size. And therefore we're saying that because the bigger chutzner is 11 amos and the smaller chutzner is 10 amos, therefore there's enough space to have a lechi on either side of the entrance. But then why, meaning from the perspective of the larger chutzner, well then why does the brisa need to say that the larger chutzner is 11 amos wide? It could even be much less than that. Well, not much, but it's, anywhere between 10 amos and 11 amos, since the lechi, if Rebbe doesn't hold like Rabbi Yossi, if he holds like the Chachamim, well then the lechi could be any amount. So as long as the larger chutzner is just any amount larger than the smaller chutzner, it could be, let's say, 10 right? He says 10 and 2 tefachim, but it can even be less than 10 and 2 tefachim. The point is, 10 and something, enough to, have some lechi on the outside of the entrance into the chutzner, into a larger chutzner from the smaller chutzner, that would be enough. So why say 11 amos wide? And if you're explaining how come the smaller chutzner is aser, it's because the larger one is 11. Well, well then why don't you just make our lives much easier and prevent us from having to make this whole hack according to Ravina, where it's like skewed and off to the side, and then talk about lavud? Why don't you just say, instead of that the larger chutzner is 11 amos, just say it's like 20 amos wide. Say that the larger chutzner is 20 amos wide, the smaller chutzner is 10 amos wide, and there is absolutely no question that there's going to be lavud over here, and therefore we just have to apply Reb Zera, which is that the walls of the smaller hatzer extend into the larger hatzer, and therefore there's no lechi on either side of it, and that is why, right, and there's no question of lavud because the larger hatzer is so big that these extended walls are so far away from the outer walls of the hatzer, and there's no lechis or anything, and that's why you can't carry in the smaller hatzer. Now, but the Brisa obviously doesn't say it. It says 11. So therefore, therefore, as we explained, it is way neater to explain that it's talking about nidon mibachutz, that nir mibachutz v'shavim mibifnim is not considered a good lechi, and then things just become way simpler. It's beautiful. It works out perfectly. How come the outer one is 11 amos and the smaller one is 10 amos? Because when you take that extra tefach and you divide it in half, you have the 3 tefachim on either side of the entrance, which is the perfect size for a lechi. If you assume like Rebbe that you need 2 lechis, and like Rabbi Yossi that each lechi needs to be 3 tefachim, it works out beautifully. But if you say nir mibachutz v'shavim mibifnim nidon mishum lechi, it becomes a humongous mess. So therefore, it's pretty clear that the Mishnah was assuming, or is assuming, that nir mibachutz v'shavim mibifnim eino nidon mishum lechi. Amar Rav Yosef lo shmiya li ashmaitza. Rav Yosef lucked out, and he didn't hear this whole sugya, so he was spared. So Amar le Abaye at amart nirlan v'ha amart nirlan. Abaye says, actually, Rav Yosef, that's just wishful thinking. We know that Rav Yosef, when he got older, he forgot much of his learning, and Abaye says, actually, Rav Yosef, you do know this sugya, and also, meaning, who said that nir mibachutz v'shavim mibifnim is nidon kilechi? That was Rabbi Bar Rav Huna. So Rav Yosef was saying, and Rabbi Bar Rav Huna was the son of Rav Huna. So what Rav Yosef was saying is that he never heard this from Rav Huna. Right? Of course we know that Rav Yosef was a student of Rav Yehuda, but Rav Yehuda and Rav Huna were contemporaries. And what Rav Yosef was saying is that, if Rav Huna would have said it, he was pretty confident that he would have heard it. Interestingly, there was a Rashi in Masechta Nida and the Aflam Testament Aleph that also described a similar thing where this happened in the name of Shmuel, and Rav Yosef said something similar, which is like, if Shmuel would have said that, I would have heard that from Rav Huda, from Rav Yehuda. So he's saying the similar thing now about Rav Huna. Like, if Rav Huna really said it, so then I would have known that. And therefore, Rav Yosef was confused as to why this is the first time he's hearing this statement of Rav Huna, of Rabbi Bar Rav Huna in the name of his father, Rav Huna, to which Abaye is reminding him, and he's saying, no, actually, Rav Yosef, you do know this, and you actually taught it to us. And here it goes. So Rav Yosef lo shmieli hashmaitza. Rav Yosef said, look, I never heard this statement, this teaching of Rav Huna, to say that nir mibifnim v'shavim mibachutz is nidon kilechi. So, no, nir mibachutz v'shavim mibifnim is nidon kilechi. So, Amale Abaye, atomar nialan v'aha amart nialan. So Abaye says, look, Rav Yosef, you did tell us this, and it was in the following context. Rami bar Abba Amar Rav Huna, that Rami bar Abba said in the name of Rav Huna, Lechi amoshech im dofno shel mavui. If you have a lechi that is in a straight line with the side of the mavui, i.e., it's near b'chutz v'shavim mibifnim, pachus midal amos. As long as this lechi is less than 4 amos, nidon mishum lechi. So then it's a good lechi, and you can carry in the mavui. Umishtamish im chudai apnimi, and you could carry in the lechi up until where you can carry in the mavui up until where the lechi begins. Dalet amis, but if the lechi sticks out 4 amis, well then nidon mishum mavui. Well then, as we saw, what was it yesterday? Then it becomes its own mavui, and you also the shamish bechula, and you wouldn't be allowed to use it at all. The entire mavui you wouldn't be allowed to use because there's no lechi over there. And as we saw yesterday, it would need its own lechi in order to carry by this other lechi, which is now a mavui. And Rav Yosef, you told us about this teaching of Rav Huna. Shma mina tlas, that we learned 3 things from it. Shma mina ben lechi and aser. We learn that you're not allowed to walk beside a lechi. V'shma mina meshach mavui ba'arba. And we learn from this that the depth of a mavui is 4 amis. Now we saw that was a machlokas on Daf Hey. We saw it was a machlokas between Abaye and Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef actually said that the depth of a mavui is 4 tfachim, where Abaye said it's 4 amis. Maybe this is why Abaye was assuming that it was 4 amis, because he heard this teaching from Rav Yosef. But nonetheless, I guess Rav Yosef still thought it was 4 tfachim. and he was just explaining Rav Huna's opinion. And we also see that nir mibachutz v'shavim b'fnim would be considered a lechi. And so we see that Rav Huna did in fact say that, and that's where his son Rabbi bar Rav Huna got it from. Even though we had this very elaborate proof to show that actually nir mibachutz v'shavim b'fnim shouldn't be considered a lechi. And the halacha is that nir mibachutz v'shavim b'fnim would actually be a good lechi. The Gemara says, what do you mean? Didn't we just prove wrong in an elaborate question, in an elaborate challenge, that nir mibachutz v'shavim b'fnim would not be a good lechi? So we basically proved it wrong, and yet the halacha is like that? Yes. Mishum detani Rabbi Chia kavasi, because Rabbi Chia taught another brisa which says that nir mibachutz v'shavim b'fnim would be considered a good lechi, and therefore we go like that. So now we finally continue in our Mishnah. So the Mishnah said that when a mavui is wider than 10 amos, you have to make it smaller. Amar Abai had gesagt, Tana v'arochav me'eser yimayit v'b'yidol omer eino tzarich limayit. Okay, so Abai says that we have a brisa, and we quoted this on Beis and Beis, that Abai says that because in our Mishnah it was not clear what Rabbi Yehuda's opinion was, right? Meaning it says that if a mavui is larger than 20, is higher than 20 amos, so then you have to make it smaller. And Rabbi Yehuda said no, you don't need to. Now then the Mishnah continued and said that if it's wider than 10 amos, you have to make it smaller. And Rabbi Yehuda didn't say anything. So Abai is clarifying for us that there's a brisa in which Rabbi Yehuda explicitly says that you don't need to make it any thinner. So narrower, maybe. Ve'ad kama. So how narrow do you have to make it, right? Meaning, no. Scratch that. Ve'ad kama. When Rabbi Yehuda says that the mavui can be wider than 10 amos, does it mean that it can just be extremely, extremely wide, right? What is the maximum width according to Rabbi Yehuda? So Savra of Achai Kamed Rav Yosef Lemeimar. So Rav Achai was in front of Rav Yosef, and he wanted to say Ad Shlosh Esrei Amma U'Shlish, that the mavui could be as wide as 13 and a third amos. Very, very particular. V'kavachomer min Pasi Beiros, and because we learned that out from a kavachomer from Pasi Beiros. Pasi Beiros are there were wells, so basically when people would be ola regel from wherever they were to go to Yerushalayim, so they would build wells along the way so that people, when they're traveling, would have water. So now, on Shabbos, this was kind of complicated because the wells were 10 tefachim deep, which makes them and 4 by 4 tefachim wide, which makes them their own Rosh Hashanah. Now, if you're standing in Rosh Hashanah and drawing water from this well, you're basically taking water from Rosh Hashanah and bringing it to you and yourself in Rosh Hashanah. So what they would do is they would build basically these 4 corners, let's say, like these 4 L-shaped kind of corners around the well, and these L-shaped corners would be enough to consider the area around the well a Rosh Hashanah. Now the Chiddush over here is that these are parts Muruba ala Omed, which means that there was more space in these Pasi Beiros than there was wall. You just basically had these little L's in these corners, but all the space in between them was just space. And nonetheless, that was acceptable. And we say that by the Pasi Beiros, it was allowed up to 13 and a third amos of space. And it was all, Rashi talks about a cheshbon, has to do with the width of cows or whatever it is. So Rav Achai wanted to teach in front of Rav Yosef that we can learn out a kavachomer from Pasi Beiros. Ma Pasi Beiros sheitartu ben paritz mubala omed lo itartu ben yosem shlosh esrei amu shlish. So when it comes to Pasi Beiros, which is the more makil opinion, or the more makil side of our equation, Pasi Beiros, you're allowed to even have paritz mubala omed. You're allowed to have more space than wall, right? Generally by walls, one of the rules is that there needs to be more wall than there is space. But over here you can have more space than wall. So we see that we're being makil regarding that, and yet we have a cap of 13 and a third amos. Well then, mavui shelo itartabo parutz mubala omed. Well, by mavui, where you're not, it's a stricter case. You're not allowed to have more space than wall. Well then, einu din shelo tatir bo yosem mishlosh esrei ama. Well then, ushlish. Well then, certainly it would make sense to cap that at 13 and a third. Oh, and by the way, important point, it's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion by the Pasei Beiros that it's a maximum of 13 and a third amos. So you're also, by the case of mavui, logically speaking, it would make sense to say that Rabbi Yehuda would cap that as well by 13 and a third amos. But Pasei Beiros, am I reading the same thing twice? No, kind of. I think I skipped words. V'hanu senes. The Gemara says, yeah, but that is not a good kav v'chomer because I can do all sorts of stuff with that kav v'chomer. Pasei beiros she'tayta bayin parts muba ala omed lo tater bayin yosim shlosh eser am v'shlish. I could maybe argue that no, if we're already being makil by Pasei Beiros to say, we're going out of our way to do Pasei Beiros a favor and say, look, you're allowed to have more space than walls so that the cows can get in or whatever it is. So we're kind of already giving you that favor. We're not going to be more makil than we need to and say, look, you're only allowed to do 13 and a third and no more than that. However, mavui shlo itayta ben parutz muba ala omed, but mavui, we're not forgetting anything for you, right? We're not allowing you to have more space than wall, so then maybe I'll sort of give in a different place and allow you to have it be larger than 13 and a third. Tater bo yosim gimel amos v'shlish. Right? So therefore, I could make the argument that why not be more makel by mavui? After all, we're not makel in other places, so let's at least be makel by this and say it can be more than 13 and a third. So or else you could say liidach kisa, or I can make the argument that you shouldn't be allowed to have 13 and a third by a mavui because Pasei Beiros the ikalta behu. Or maybe I'll make the argument that by Pasei Beiros, so since it's already a more makel situation that you're allowed to have parts muba ala omed, so then I might also make the argument that is why we allow you up to 13 and a third. But by mavui, which we don't allow you to have parts muba ala omed, well then maybe you can't have anything more than 10 amos. So from that kav v'chomer from Pasei Beiros, we're not really going to get too far. And then the Gemara just kind of leaves this here, and we don't really answer what the max for Rabbi Yehuda in terms of width is. Tani Levi taught, mavui shu rachav esrim amma. What if you have a mavui that is 20 amos wide? No, it's kana b'emtsaiso v'dayo. So Levi gives this interesting answer, which is, well, just take some kind of a stick, a staff or something, a branch, stick it in the middle, and then now you have, just 10 amos on either side. Problem solved. Hutani lavuhu amar la de'ena lacha kosa mishnah. Well, Levi taught that brisa. It says mishnah, meaning teaching. Levi taught that brisa, but he also said that the halacha is not like that brisa. Igad amar, because all you have is basically like let's just say like a reed or something. You take a reed, you stuck it in the ground. That's not exactly a wall, right? It's just going to get absorbed, as we're going to see in a few minutes, that when you have a wall that is completely consumed by air space around it, such as this stick that's completely consumed by the 10 amos of space to the right and to the left, well then it's just going to be batal and non-existent. The those who say that it wasn't Levi who said that the lacha is not like that brisa, rather it was Shmuel who said in the name of Levi that the lacha is not like that brisa. Seder. So what do you do? So if you have a mavui that's 20 amos wide, what do you do? How can you carry in that mavui? What can you do to allow yourself to carry in that mavui? Shmuel mishmei de Levi. So it says Shmuel in the name of Levi. Ose pas gavoa asar b'meshech arba amis umamida lo orko shel mavui. So Shmuel says in the name of Levi, what you can do is, so there's a diagram lemaisa. There's a diagram on 10b1 on the left side, where you can see that what you do is, so you basically put like a little, you basically divide the mavui in two, and you build a wall that is 10 tfachim tall and 4 amos deep into the mavui, and that way it's basically like its own mavui, right? You basically constructed, now you have 2 mavuis essentially, so this width of 10 amos is now basically 2 mavuis that each have 10 amos width, and then you just put up a lechi in each one, and now you can carry in each one. So, inami, or else could Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, could Rav Yehuda, or it's like Rav Yehuda, the Amar Rav Yehuda, mavui shurach of 15 amos. If you have a mavui that's 15 amos wide, marchik shtei amos v'osa pas shalosh amos. So what you could do is, you could take, and you could see this also on the same page, on the left side, on the bottom diagram. So what you do is that you could see a mavui that is 15 amos wide. So what you do is from the left side, it could also be the right side, but in this case it's from the left side. So then you have 2 amos of space, and then you have like this wall that is 3 amos. And then what happens is, by doing that, so then you basically have, it's considered like you have wall on the first 5 amos of the width, and now you only have a Pesach of 10 amos, and that's okay. Now we are going to discuss this wall that is 5 amos wide, that is constructed of this one piece that is 3 amos, and then space to the left of it that is 2 amos. Ve'amai, why does he have to construct it in this way? 2 amos of space and then 3 amos of wall. Yaise pas amav v'mechza v'yarchik shtei amos v'yaise pas amav v'mechza. Instead, why don't you do this? That by the left side of the mavui, add a like pas, kilo alechi kazek, like a board that is 1.5 amos, and then have a space of 2 amos, and then another board that is 1.5 amos for a total of the same 5 amos. But instead of having 2 amos space and then 3 amos wall, have an 1.5 wall, 2 amos space, and another 1.5 wall, and that's a total of 5. Why not do it that way? Shmamina omed mubal aparts mishtei ruches lo ave omed. So the Gemara wants to make the argument that from the fact that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't say that, well, that implies that when you have a case where, in this wall of 5 amos, so you do have a total of more wall than you have space, right? You have an 1.5 of wall, 2 amos of space, and another 1.5 of wall. So an 1.5 plus an 1.5 is 3. So you have 3 amos of wall, 2 amos of space. However, the 3 amos of wall are divided in half on either side of the 2 amos of space. So basically, you have Omed Mubal parts, but only when you add together the wall from both sides. So let's make the argument from the fact that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't bring that as an example, that when you have, so let's make the argument that when you have Omed Mubal parts, but it's Mishtei Ruchos, Lo Have Omed, then that would not be considered good enough. No, really I'll say that in a general, if you have Omed Mubal parts in this manner, it will be fine. So for example, let's say you have, some kind of space that's like 10 amos wide, and for whatever reason you want to make it smaller. So let's say you add 3 amos of wall on either side. So you have 4 amos of space in the middle, which is more than the 3 amos on either side. Yet when they join together, it would be like 6 versus 4, and that would be acceptable. Gosh, maybe that confused things, but I don't think I can really confuse things more than they are already, probably. So let's see. V'shani acha. Wow, I should really unsay that, but I don't think I'm going to edit it out. Let's go weiter. V'shani acha da'asi avira dehagisa v'avira dehagisa u'muvatale. So the Gemara says no. In theory, you would be able to, when the boards on either side of the space are less than the space, but when you add them together, it's more than the space, that would be acceptable. However, this is a different situation because if you would do that, if you would do an 1.5 of board, 2 amos of space, another 1.5 of board, well, guess what, friends? We forgot about something. The 10 amos of monster space next to that. So when you have the 10 amos of the big Pesach, and then you have 1.5 amos of this board, and then next to that is 2 amos of more space, well then it's that mesquite little board in the middle is completely overwhelmed by the airspace around it, because both sides are larger than it, so therefore it would become baton. It's like it doesn't exist, and then you don't have a wall that's 5 amos anymore. So v'yaise pas ama, v'yarchik ama, v'yaise pas ama, v'yarchik ama, v'yaise pas ama. But why don't you make one board that's an amma wide, and then make space that's an amma wide, and then a board that's an amma wide, and then space that's an amma wide, and then board that's an amma wide. So basically, you have 3 amos of board, 2 amos of space. However, they're spread out among 3 separate boards with an amma of space in between each one. So why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda say that? Why doesn't Rav Yehuda say that? So Shmamina Omed Kifarutz Asur. So we see from there that wouldn't work either. That when you have the boards being the same size of the space, that wouldn't work. But the Gemara gives the same answer. Really, I'll say that when the boards in the space are the same size, that's acceptable. But it's different over here. So they say that, but that wouldn't work over here because you have the 10 amos of space on the right side of that first board. Then next to it you have an amma of space, and then when they come together, so it'll be mevatel that first board. But if it was just, if you didn't have that 10 amos of space to the right of it, if you just had a board and space, board space, and they're all the same size, that would be acceptable. V'yarchik amma v'yaise pas amma v'mechza v'yarchik amma v'yaise pas amma v'mechza. But why don't you do this? Why don't you have an amma of space and then an amma and a half of board, an amma of space, an amma and a half of board? So here you have 5 tfachim, 5 amos, and from the 5 amos you have 3 amos of board, 2 amos of space. So you have more board than you have space, and also because each board is 1.5 amos, so then and the space next to it is only 1 amma, well then while the air space to the right of the first board would be 10 amos, but to the left of it would only be 1 amma, and it itself is 1.5 amos, so therefore you don't have the airspace on both sides of it overwhelming it, only on one side of it, well then that would actually be a good wall. So why doesn't Rav Yehuda give that example? He could have given that example, but the rabbis aren't going to be that complicated. Why not? Why not? I mean, once you've gotten this complicated, you may as well just go all out. Let's go weiter. 1 second, Rabbi Yehuda, should we be concerned that you have this big opening of 10 amos, and then you have 3 amos of board, and then you have another 2 amos of space? But shouldn't we be concerned that people are going to walk through the 2 amma of space and ignore the larger opening, and then basically you lost your Pesach to the mavui? So Amr Rav Bar Masna Chazaka Inad Maniach Pesach Gadol v'Nichnas b'Pesach Katan. Very interesting. So Rav Bar Masna gives a very interesting answer, which is that we have a chazaka. We can assume that when you have a big entrance and a small entrance, people are not going to ignore the big entrance and go into the small entrance. Well, who is this? Rav Bar Masna was clearly not a software developer. The general rule is, if users can do it, they will do it. So I don't know, from my experience, I guess I would see this differently, but how come this should be any different than Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi? Meaning, Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi the other day, they had a situation where if you go into the mavui, and there's a korah, and then there's less than 4 tfachim into the mavui, there's like a breach of 3 tfachim wide. So Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi would say that the mavui is no good anymore, and because people might go in through the side of the mavui, and then the entrance will be batal. So why don't we say the same thing over here, that people are going to go in through the smaller entrance? So hasam kamamayit bilucha, hacha lo kamamayit bilucha. There's a difference over there by the by Rabbi Amin or Rabbi Asi, the breach is on the side, and therefore it's actually a shortcut to get into the mavui, and people will ignore the main entrance. But over here, both entrances are on the same side, and therefore people would prefer to take the larger entrance rather than the shorter one, the smaller one. Fine. Tnan hasam, we learned Darton. Where? Masechta Kelim. Oh my gosh, man. When I was learning this Gemara, and we got to Masechta Kelim, I said, just what I need right now. Masechta Kelim. I was not happy about this, but don't worry, it's not that hard. It's really just applying, Paretz Muba al Ha'omed to toilet seats. So, I feel like we can handle that. Okay, friends, bear with me. Just, another little bit, and then we can, go run along, do our little lives. So, we learn over there in Masechta Kelim. Ora Asla, the hide of a toilet seat. So basically what they would have is like some kind of, like stool, like some kind of a stand, and it would have 2 straps of leather on like either end of it, and then no leather, basically just air in the middle. So you'd have a strap of leather, some space, and another strap of leather in the back, and that was basically their toilet seat. So, v'chalol shelo mitztarfim b'tefach. So now what happens if there is a flesh of a corpse, under that toilet seat? So does the toilet seat become a ohel hames over that flesh of corpse flesh? That's the question. How much space is allowed? So my ora asla. What's this ora asla? Amar Rabbi Bechana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, or kisui shel beis hakisei. It's a toilet seat. Bechama. So how do we deal with this toilet seat? Is it considered a ohel over a kazayis if there's a kazayis of b'sar mes or not? So when Rav Dimi came, he said, okay, so this toilet seat, so you can have 2 fingers width of, 2 fingers of width of leather, 2 fingers of space, 2 fingers of leather, okay? Wait, did I just skip? So Ravin says that you'd have 1.5 fingers of leather, and then 1 finger of space, and then another 1.5 fingers of leather. So according to Rav Dimi, it's a total of 6. According to Ravin, it's a total of 4. Now this kind of lines up to all these sugyas that we've been talking about just now with like these boards and spaces and stuff like that, right? Because so according to Rav Dimi, he's giving an example where you have equal amounts of space and leather. According to Ravin, he's giving an example where both sides of leather are larger than the space of air that's in between. So Amalei Abai Rav Dimi mi pligisu. So Abai says to Rav Dimi, do you and Ravin agree or do you argue? Amalei lo. He says no, we do not argue at all. When I'm talking about 6 fingers, I'm talking about 6 small fingers. When Ravin is talking about 4 fingers, he's talking about thumbs. Okay, fine. Velo pliginon, and we don't actually argue on each other. Amalei. So Abai then said to Rav Dimi, Le'i pligisu. Abai says to Rav Dimi, what do you mean? Of course you guys argue. Meaning, sure, you might have a total, a total of a tefach, right? Meaning because 6 small fingers and 4 large fingers they're both the equivalent, they're both a tefach. So therefore, Rav Dimi is arguing that really him and Ravin are talking about the same size toilet seat. However, Abai is pointing out that there is a big difference, which is that according to Rav Dimi, all sizes were equal, right? There was 2 fingers of leather, 2 fingers of space, 2 fingers of leather. So you have each, that would be basically the equivalent of like, let's say when we had 1 amma of wall, 1 amma of space, 1 amma of wall, 1 amma of space, right? And Rav Dimi seems to be saying that that's acceptable, whereas Ravin's example was actually where each of the 2 leather strips were 1.5 fingers, whereas the space in between was only 1 finger. So he was giving an example where the covered space actually each one has to be larger than the space in between it. So, and clearly you guys are arguing about when you have more omed than you have parutz, but only when you add them together. So you, Rav Dimi, are saying that 2 fingers, 2 fingers, 2 fingers, they're all the same, but when you add them together, you have 4 amos, right? Whereas, not 4 amos, basically 4 fingers versus 2 fingers, 4 fingers of leather versus 2 fingers of space, whereas Rav Dimi is talking about where Rav Dimi says that would not work. You need each portion of leather to be individually larger than the space, and therefore he says that each leather strip would have to be 1.5 fingers, while the space is only 1 finger. So l'didach have omed. So according to you, Rav Dimi, that would be fine. L'ravin meruach achas have omed mishtei ruches lo have omed. Whereas Ravin would argue, no, you need each leather strap, or in the case of the walls, each board to be individually larger than the space, but not only when they're added together. Because Rav Dimi, if you think that you don't argue, well then the Ravin heichi ibai hachi ibai le'lememar etzba v'shlish mikan ve'etzba v'shlish mikan ve'etzba v'shlish revach be'emsa. Because if Ravin agreed with you, Rav Dimi, well then instead of saying 1.5 amos, 1.5 fingers of leather and then 1 finger of space, he should have said that each leather strip was 1 1/3, and then you would still get to your 4, to your 4 fingers, and they would all be the same. But he doesn't say that. He dafka goes out of his way to say that there has to be, the leather strips have to be wider than the space. Vela my pliginon. So what do we? So then Rav Dimi responds saying, yeah, what? But you really think that we argue, and that I'm saying that right that it would be acceptable when you have the leather only when they're added together, that it's more than the space. If that was the case, then I should have said etzba v'shnei shlishim mikan ve'etzba v'shnei shlishim mikan ve'etzba ayim v'shnei shlishim revach be'emtza. If that was the case, that I'm saying that you're even allowed to consider it to be covered when the strips are only larger than the space when they're combined, well then what I should have given as an example is that each strip was 1 2/3 fingers, and the middle was 2 2/3. Because if you do 1 2/3 and 2 2/3, that's 3 1/3 plus another 2 2/3 is basically your 6 fingers. So if that was the case, then we would have an example of where each leather strip individually is less than the space in the middle, i.e. 1 2/3 is less than 2 2/3, but when you add them together, then it's 3 1/3, which is more than 2 2/3. So the palginon v'parutz komin palginon, rather just about the most you could say, says Rav Dimi, is that we argue about when they're exactly equal, not just when you add them together they're more than that, but they're smaller individually. No, that I would agree with Ravin that would not work. However, we argue when the leather and each, the 2 strips of leather as well and the space in between are each the same amount. Friends, that was Daf Yud of Masechta Ayruvin. Let us do a review. So we started off where we had talking about that larger hatzer, which is 11 amos wide, and the smaller hatzer, which is 10 amos wide. So we say that if you're talking about near b'chutz v'shavim b'fnim eino nidon kelechi, so then that's fine. Everything adds up perfectly because Rebbe holds like Rabbi Yossi that right. So first of all, Rebbe says that we hold like Rebbe. The Mishnah is going like Rebbe that you need 2 lechis, and he holds like Rabbi Yossi that each lechi has to be 3 tvachim. So it just kind of works out perfectly. But if you say that near b'chutz v'shavim b'fnim is nidon kelechi, well then it becomes a complete mess. But we said in the end, we still say that near me b'chutz v'shavim b'fnim is nidon kelechi. Then we talk about a mavui that is 20 amos wide. So we have Shmuel said the name of Levi that we can do is you can create 2 mavuis, right? Basically, you just split it in half for the length of 4 amos, and then you have like 2 mavuis. Rav Yehuda says that what you do is you basically make like 5 amos of wall at one side, made up of 3 amos of wall and 2 amos of space. Then we talked about all these other configurations, and we talked about this toilet at the end. Rav Dimi said that it needs to be 2 finger breadths of leather, 2 finger breadths of space, another 2 finger breadths of leather. Ravin says that it's 1.5 of finger, 1 finger, and 1.5 of finger, and they kind of argue about when they're all the same size. Friends, that was Daf Yud. I'm sure you guys really enjoyed that. Peace.